Good morning, and thank you for joining me for one of our many employer panels. My name is Justin Polk, and I am the Assistant Deputy Director for Workforce Policy in the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, the primary sponsor of the Employer Panel Initiative. I would also like to thank our supporting partners, United Way of Mass Bay, SkillsWorks of the Boston Foundation as well. Today's panel is brought to you by Building Pathways, an innovative registered apprenticeship training and career program that works to diversify and provide equitable access into the building trades. Today's panelists are Dr. Alicia Sasser-Modestino. Our moderator today is, she's the Associate Professor of the School of Public Policy and Urban Affairs and in the Department of Economics at Northeastern University. Our moderator is Brian Doherty. He is the General Agent of the Building and Construction Trades Council of the Metropolitan District. And our panelists today are Dan Bent. He's the Executive Vice President of American Plumbing and Heating Corps. Linda Dorsino-Forey, Vice President of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community for the Northeast for Suffolk Construction, and John McLaughlin, President of Sullivan McLaughlin. So in this third panel, Dr. Alicia Modestino is going to start off by explaining the latest labor market data. We would love to hear from you, so if you have questions or comments, please type them in the chat box to the right, and then we'll be sending those questions to our panelists, and the moderator will pose them for the rest of the audience as well. Please note that this discussion is being recorded and will be updated to our website, owdboston.gov. And with that, I will turn it over to Alicia.
Great, thanks, Justin. Can you pull up my slides for me? And go to the beginning.
Oh, sorry.
Great, thanks so much. So I'll be giving you a bird's eye view of a lot of data related to the construction industry and employment, unemployment, and job trends in the construction industry. So bear with me. This is a high-level flyover to give us a little context for the panel discussion. Justin, if you could go to the next slide. So I think every economic presentation should start with this slide, even though it looks like it has no economics on it. And that is to reinforce the message that there can be no economic recovery without sustained containment of the coronavirus. This is the daily caseload count maintained by Johns Hopkins University, plotted with key dates for our shutdown and our reopening. This is for the state of Massachusetts. When this chart was made on August 29th, there were 460 new cases and 16 new deaths in Massachusetts. So we've kept a fairly low caseload during reopening, but you can see a little bit of an uptick there in the month of August, as we've seen caseloads rise from about 200 to about 400 a day. And then in addition, we know that we do have some hotspots around the state, particularly in communities of color like Brockton, Chelsea, Everett, Lawrence, Lynn, Revere. And if we want to keep people working, and if we want kids to get back to school in person, then I cannot stress enough that we need to keep doing the right things with wearing masks, social distancing, and staying home when we're sick. It's not a matter of lives versus livelihoods. The two just cannot be separated. Justin, can you go to the next slide? Why do I say that with such confidence? Because of this chart. What is this? This is charting for you job postings in Massachusetts overall, so the total number of job postings, as well as the total number of job postings in construction month by month, actually week by week since January of 2019. And what you'll notice is February 23rd, you'll see that there was a drop in job postings that occurred even before Governor Baker issued any kind of stay-at-home order. Why is that? Because people are smart. They read about what's happening in their local area or other places. They make decisions based on what's safe for them, their families, and their businesses. And if people don't feel safe, they don't go out, and they don't spend money. And then we're right back to where we started. You'll also notice from this chart that we see an uptick in postings right before each phase of the reopening as we inch toward an economic recovery. And we want to keep that upward trend going. And the best way to do that, again, is to make sure we contain the virus so that people can be going back to work, they can be going about their daily routines, and they can be keeping the economy going. Next slide, please. Now, the construction industry actually did not suffer as much as other industries during the pandemic, even though a number of jobs were lost. It wasn't as severely hit as some industries like accommodation and food services. So that's the restaurant and hotel industry that's been the most severely affected. Healthcare and social assistance, which ironically enough, some parts of healthcare were overwhelmed and other parts were completely shut down, the non-essential services, and even retail trade as well. This is showing you the continued claims for unemployment insurance by industry for the city of Boston. And the good news in the construction industry is that initial claims for unemployment insurance, which means new workers who are filing unemployment insurance claims, has been falling in the construction industry since the reopening, which is great. That means workers are being recalled. That means we're not adding workers to the unemployment rolls. We still have continued claims, meaning workers that are still unemployed. They're still above their pre-pandemic levels, but not by very much. And so construction's actually that red line right there. And you can see that's pretty much almost fallen back to the pre-pandemic levels. And that's in contrast to some of these other industries where we've seen accommodation and food services in particular, lots of workers initially laid off. And then even during the reopening phase, you see that green line increasing even as we reopen in phase 1 and phase 2. And that's because those industries are reopening at such a reduced capacity that workers who initially were furloughed thinking they would go back to work are not being all recalled. And so they're actually increasing the unemployment rolls. We don't have that issue in construction, which is a benefit for the industry. Next slide, please. That's not to say that construction didn't lose a lot of jobs during the pandemic. So between March and April, the construction sector lost 25,800 jobs. That's a 40% drop in employment for the sector, which is just massive, along with lots of other industries that experience that kind of job loss. A lot of the job loss was in specialty trade contractors. You see that dotted red line there just drop suddenly between March and April. We also saw a fall in employment among workers who are in construction of buildings. But you'll see that those two lines have largely rebounded to where they were prior to the pandemic. So we've recovered about 90% of the pre-pandemic levels of employment in construction. You can see manufacturing in comparison didn't suffer as much of a job loss. They have also recovered almost as many jobs that were lost during the pandemic. But in contrast, you can see for transportation and warehousing, that's an industry where employment fell and really not many of the jobs have been recovered there. So again, construction has really had that V-shaped recovery in terms of a labor market that we're not seeing in other industries. Next slide, please. So interestingly, prior to the pandemic, we saw an increasing share of jobs in construction that required some kind of education, whether it was a vocational education, an associate's degree, or even a bachelor's degree. And that's something that we've been seeing across the board in lots of industries as more and more employers are looking for skilled workers. We live in a region where we do have a large supply of skilled workers. And so prior to the pandemic, that had also been a trend in construction. But you can see between the dark blue bar and the green bar there, so between 2020 Q1 and Q2, we saw a drop, at least in terms of jobs that were requiring a bachelor's degree. And some of that is a change in the mix of jobs that are being that are in demand in the construction industry. So I'll show you in the next slide that we're hiring fewer specialty engineers, right, who largely have a bachelor's degree. We're hiring more technicians who don't necessarily have a bachelor's degree, but are more likely to have an associate's or a vocational degree. And the other is also reducing some of those job requirements to be able to fill essential in-person jobs, right? And we also saw that in the healthcare industry as well. Next slide, please. So among the top 20 most frequent job titles in construction, we are seeing some more of the same and also some changes. So what is this showing you, this slide? It looks really busy, but these are tree maps. And tree maps, these boxes here show you the relative demand for different job titles in the construction industry. So bigger boxes mean greater demand for that job title. And I'm comparing here the second quarter of 2020, which is the most recent data that we have right now, compared to the same time last year to show you what's changed over time during the pandemic. And one of the things we're seeing is that lots of managers and technicians are still in high demand. They were always among the top 20 job postings, things like construction managers, assistant managers, project managers, but those boxes have grown even bigger as we have reopened the economy. And that there's, again, as I mentioned before, that shift away from hiring sort of these specialty engineers. So hiring things like electrical engineers and quality engineers, they've actually even fallen off the top 20. You can't even find them in the boxes on the right-hand side. And instead now we're seeing jumping into the top 20 things like delivery drivers, plumbers, right? The essential jobs are like keeping the construction going, as opposed to perhaps designing or planning new construction. We've also seen, in the sort of the back of the house, if you will, a shift from hiring things like accountants to hiring sales reps, right? So getting back out there and getting the business going. Next slide, please. Then we also, so this looks almost like identical to what we were seeing before, but now instead of looking at job titles, we're looking at the skills that are required in those job postings. So Burning Glass Technologies, where we get all this data from, they scrape all of the words related to skill job postings, and we can actually quantify what kinds of skills are being asked for. Not too surprisingly, right, we're asking again for a lot of the same management skills, but also IT skills have become very important. Sales skills, again, are in high demand. A shift away, from general accounting, and again, an increase in shifting towards some of those more skilled trades like plumbing and electrical, and sort of those really essential in-person type skills and jobs that need to be filled right now to get jobs done, to get jobs back on track. Next slide, please. So one of the things that I want us to keep in mind, we might be concerned about training or planning for the future, especially given the uncertain nature in terms of where construction is going to go in the future. I know a lot of investment firms have put things on hold. We're now in that election cycle where everybody's afraid to invest in anything until they find out where the lay of the land is. But one of the things I want us to keep in mind is that, there's always been a skills gap in construction. And part of that has just been due to demographics, where we're seeing an older labor force. This is true in many industries that are retiring, folks who are really skilled in what they do in a lot of these hands-on types of jobs that require not only technical training in terms of how to actually perform a particular task or a particular skill, but also experience in terms of how to do it well, right? Especially in terms of thinking about the quality of construction. And so this is not going to be disappearing, and it might even be exacerbated. So 12% of construction workers are age 60 plus. We know that's a vulnerable population for contracting COVID. And not that I'm forecasting illness or anything, but one thing we've seen, for example, in the education sector, is lots of retirements among older workers who maybe, the time to retire and not return to the classroom if you're over 60 is now because there are concerns about contracting COVID. And so I want us to keep in mind that we should be thinking about the future and planning for the future, even while we're still in the pandemic. And what does that mean? So that means keeping apprenticeship programs going, making sure that we are training the next generation and figuring out how to do that in a pandemic. So, my university is reopening and figuring out how to do hybrid and remote learning and all of those kinds of things. That's a lot more challenging in a vocational setting where you actually need real hands-on kinds of experiences. And I know that there have been some programs who have figured out how to do that and how to do that safely. And we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. Next slide, please. So one of the things I want us to keep an eye on as well is looking at construction spending. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty right now in terms of where caseloads will be going, at least nationally. In Massachusetts, we're doing great. I know there's always a concern what will happen in the fall with flu and a wave 2, and what will that mean in terms of keeping everything open. There's also this election thing coming up in November that makes people wary about investing. I wanted us to get this long perspective. What is this showing you? This is showing you total construction spending, as well as the breakdown for non-residential and residential. And I want to show you that, yes, we've had a dip in construction spending. That's not too surprising, but it's nowhere near the magnitude that we saw during the Great Recession. And in fact, so far, non-residential spending has not had as much of a dip as residential spending, but there are some dim forecasts that are on the horizon. So the American Institute of Architects consensus construction forecast found that spending on non-residential building projects is on the decline, and they expect it to 21. They're estimating an overall dip of about 8% in spending in 2020 and just under 5% next year. And this is really the first time in about a decade that we've seen this decline in non-residential, you know, and a lot of straightforward. We've seen investments in projects that have really waned due to economic disruptions from the coronavirus, but also just the uncertainty of what 2021 will look like, what regulations will be in place, what economy we will be living in. And, you know, it's also worth noting that the optimism, you know, that people had seen in May and June about the health of the economy has dimmed a little bit. You know, there's not really much of a call for a V-shaped economy right now. We're talking more about that Nike swoosh that you might have heard about, where there's a longer recovery period that looks a little bit more like the recovery that we had from the Great Recession. And so even though you know, there's been reopening, there is concern about what happens if the coronavirus resurges. Next slide, please. So the good news is that in the residential sector, we have seen a rebound in terms of permits and starts and completions. They're rebounding to their near pre-pandemic level. US home construction starts in July increased more than forecast. Applications really surged by a greater share than we've seen in decades. Residential starts jumped by 22.6%. That's the most since October 2016. And that's compared with the forecast from Bloomberg of only 1.25 million. So now they have revised that upwards. And so we've really been seeing the housing market, at least the residential market, being a bright spot for the economic recovery. There's a great demand right now for homes as folks are potentially leaving sort of dense city living, apartment living. This is especially a trend right now among millennials who have young children who are perhaps looking for a home in the suburbs. And then the question is, how long can we sustain this, right? So this kind of pent-up demand that occurred from the spring into the summer can only last so long. And then also in Boston, we start running out of places to actually build, right? So we've always had these constraints in terms of building codes and zoning regulations where finding places to expand and expand rapidly is difficult. Next slide, please. So what happened in Boston compared to nationally? During the spring, permitting fell more sharply in Boston and New York by 45, 46%. And that's because we had statewide restrictions compared to other metro areas that did not shut things down as much as we did. They were less affected by COVID, and so they didn't have to put these restrictions in place. But you'll see that, you know, at least in terms of permits, we've seen a rebound in permits here in Boston. That's the red line there. Along with other places as well. And so it seems like, again, you know, construction itself has had this V-shaped recovery in terms of getting back into permitting as well as building and rehiring folks. Next slide. And nationwide, new home sales have jumped this summer due to the pent-up demand that I was talking about, right? So there was not a lot of home shopping or home buying to be had in March and April, especially around the Boston area, even into May. So we've seen a lot of that pent-up demand unleashed and this will continue as long as folks hold on to their jobs, right? So one of the things we do have to keep in mind is that here in Massachusetts, we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the country right now. And there's a big question mark about the direction of that. So I think most economists would forecast that we'll see a continued improvement in the labor market, but that we don't know how rapid that improvement will be. we've also seen, right, this shift in this, a little bit of migration from dense city apartment buildings to more spacious suburban single family homes. We also know in Boston that we are severely supply constrained in terms of how many single family homes we have available and how quickly we can actually build new ones. Next slide, please. And so what we've seen in response is that listing prices on Realtor.com for both Boston and Massachusetts have increased since June, which is really surprising. Prior years, usually it's the springtime where we see most of the price increases. If something hasn't sold in the springtime, you start to see prices level out later in the summer. But because of this pent-up demand, we've actually seen prices going up for single family homes in Boston and Massachusetts, as well as nationally. And so this is, putting upward pressure on the housing market for now. The other thing that's fueling this, of course, is extremely low interest rates. If you have not refinanced and you're on this call, you should get out there right now. It's going to take you 2 months to get through the process, but it's going to be worth it for most people to do that. Next slide, please. In comparison, we've actually seen median rents declining in Boston and statewide. And some of that is because these are very two different parts of the market. So typically renters have lower incomes than homeowners. They're also less likely to maintain employment during a recession. And there's also been a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen with the return of the region's college student population, which certainly affects the level of rents in Boston. So we've seen sort of this divergence in the housing market between what's happening on the building side with new construction and new single family homes and what's been happening in the rental market. And this actually does become important because there are some projects, right, that have shifted their focus from what would have been a luxury building at this point in the city of Boston is now going to be something that's more, I wouldn't say it's affordable housing, but something that's not luxury building at this point because the tenor of the market has changed and the market for rents has softened, certainly in most cities across the United States as we think about density and concerns around spreading the coronavirus. And so this is important, even though we're not thinking too much about this, but this is important in terms of thinking about building those kinds of large rental projects. Next slide, please. So where are we now and where do we need to go in the future? As I mentioned, Massachusetts right now has the highest unemployment rate in the country. We're at 16.1%. Part of that's due to the fact that we had greater initial exposure to the coronavirus. We had a longer and much more severe shutdown. And we have some key industries here that we rely on that were impacted, like healthcare, education, tourism. And so we were just much more exposed. We also have an older population, which is a little bit more vulnerable, right, to COVID-19 as well. The good news for construction is that despite suffering these really large job losses, the industry's largely recovered most of their jobs, right? So construction's actually had something of a V-shaped recovery that other industries have not seen. Employers are hiring, but we've definitely seen this shifting, right, away from, say, more specialized engineering towards more immediate needs in the trades, right? Plumbing, electrical, let's get these things built, let's get these things back on track. Nationally, we're seeing construction investment still below pre-pandemic levels. It's not at the dire levels it was during the Great Recession, but AIA is certainly predicting a continued dip, especially as we go into this uncertain period of what will happen in the fall with COVID, what will happen in the fall with the election. And so they're really expecting construction spending in 2020 and 2021 to be down, but not severely so. So this really points to this longer term need for employers, unions, workforce development institutions to be thinking about continuing apprenticeship programs, right? We still need a pipeline of workers to be present there, not to sort of shoot ourselves in the foot in that regard. Providing worker supports, whatever that might mean in terms of, the kinds of supports that workers need to be able to continue on the job, to make sure folks are still able to earn a living. And then, of course, safety is always an important thing in the construction industry, but now, right, there's lots of additional rules and protocols, and it's still an evolving situation with COVID about even how we know these things are transmitted, what is safe, and we really have to think about what does that mean in the fall and the winter for construction, as a lot of this work is going to move towards indoors, right, which could be a completely different environment than thinking about what's occurred over the summer. So with that, I'll turn it over to our panelists, who can provide a lot more detail and flavor behind all of these numbers and think about how we move forward in construction.
Thank you, Alicia, that you're always keeping us informed on the latest labor trends, and always well done as usual. I do have one more introduction to make. I was omitted. My director, Trin Nguyen, Director of the Office of Workforce Development and the Office of Financial Empowerment for the City of Boston. She's having audio and visual difficulties today, but she has joined us in the audience. So thank you, Trin, for attending. I'm next going to turn it over to our moderator, Brian Doherty, who's going to lead the panel in its discussion. I would remind the audience if they have questions for our presenter, Dr. Modestino, or any of the panelists, you can again use the chat box feature or the questions feature to send in your questions, and they'll be directed to the moderator. Brian?
Wonderful. Justin, thank you so much, and thanks for handing it over. And Dr. Modestino, thank you for a great presentation. I work with the building trades unions, and forgive me, I'm using my phone for audio, and I hope folks can hear me. But having said that, I just want to take a quick moment to thank Mayor Walsh and thank the Walsh administration for putting the safety of our workforce and our communities first over these very difficult months of this pandemic, and making sure that we have all the safety protocols in place to keep people safe on the job and in the communities where we work. So huge thank you to Mayor Walsh and to Trin Nguyen and to everyone who helped organize this panel. And for the panel, it's a wonderful group. Collectively, between Linda Dorsina-Forey and John McLaughlin and Dan Bent and their respective organizations, these folks set the highest standards in the industry for construction. And when I say highest standards, we're talking about safety on the job site, the highest levels of training in the country, the best access to fair wages, healthcare benefits and retirement benefits. And again, with great partnerships like these, they set the standard for excellence and for equity in the industry. So I just wanted to start with that. And we have some questions in front of us because this has been a trying time that I'd like to hand it over to the folks to answer some of these questions. And just so the panelists know, I have Linda first, then John, then Dan, and then I'll rotate through that so folks have a first question for each of us. But the first question is a simple one, and Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you. Just how has the COVID pandemic impacted your business in terms of workforce and planning for the workforce over the next several months? Thank you, Linda.
Very good. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Justin, and also Dr. Modestino. Great presentation. Thank you for that question. I'll say that, and I'm happy to be on the panel with John and Dan. That no doubt COVID-19 has impacted all of us, right? Both professionally and personally, but in particularly in the construction industry. I would say that for us at Suffolk, one of the focus has always been is how do we, first it's safety first. Right? How do we make sure that people are safe as they come into the job force, but also how do we make sure that there is no harm to our employees? So I can tell you the executive committee and John Fish has really made that a priority. So even as COVID hit and we had to, shut down our jobs, which is again, Mayor Walsh and the team and the administration focusing on safety, we wanted to make sure that we kept folks whole. Right, so people were not let go. Right, people were continuing to remain safe with their families and to make sure they're protected. But for us, physically, we had to do things differently. Right, there's physical distancing when we did come back online. There was testing that was happening, that continues to happen. There's all these sanitizing stations that's been put throughout our construction sites and continues to happen. And really, it's taken into consideration how people feel individually. Right, because as Suffolk, we are a construction company, right? We are builders, but we're also information and technology as well in terms of looking at things differently. But I have to tell you that for folks in operations who are on the ground building our buildings, if they did not feel comfortable, even after the city opened up construction sites, that they felt themselves were not comfortable in coming in and being there physically, Suffolk understood that, and that's what's important, right? It's how do you create a family environment where workers feel like, wow, if I'm concerned for my safety as an individual, whether it's health concerns or family concerns, then it's okay, right? And we're able to talk it out and you can take the time. But I think the big piece for us overall, and I'm now going to stop, is that we wanted people to feel safe, right? Before we opened up anything. And so what's great is that it continues, testing continues. I can tell you every morning at 6:30 in the morning, everyone in the company gets an email to say, you know, where are you today, right? Because we want to know, are people out physically on sites? Are they working virtually from home? You know, where are they going to be? And it is collected every morning at 6:45 in the morning, because we want to be accountable to our workers as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Linda. We appreciate the update. And I'll turn it over to John McLaughlin from Sullivan McLaughlin Companies, electrical and electrical. Thank you. Thank you, John. You're up, my friend.
Thank you, Brian. So to answer the question about the impact on workforce, we certainly saw what Dr. Modestino showed on the chart. We saw a sort of V-shaped recovery. I think when our governor and our mayor made decisions to, in the city of Boston, to close job sites, that was followed by Cambridge. That certainly impacted us on the short term. We've been very pleased to get back to work, to get the workforce back to work, but to do it safely. And I will say, although it was confusing and unforeseen, the shutdown, I think our recovery and return to work as an industry has been impressive. I felt like our workers have gotten back to work, but done it safely. The testing that goes on site, the precautions that we take, the social distancing practices and protocols have gone a long way towards a sustained recovery. I think Dr. Modestino made the point, we can't really have a recovery until we learn to deal with the virus itself. And I think that's a very important point for all of us to remember on this call, and to continue to social distance and to use those precautions so we can continue to recover and continue to function as an industry. The last comment I want to make, I do think that the older population in construction, which is substantial, I do think it'll be very interesting to see what happens with that workforce, how many of them retire because of this downturn and because of the risk. I think that will have a substantial, not a negative, but a substantial impact on our industry as we try and deal with that. Dan, I'll turn back to you.
Great. Thanks, John, so much. And Dan from American Plumbing and Heating, Dan Bent, we'd love to hear how it's affecting your industry, your business in the time of COVID.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being a part of the panel today, and we feel very fortunate. We're part of the essential workforce that we've been able to bring people back to work. I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what's really happened in our industry as far as we felt it. So in March, we typically we laid off about 280 employees, and that lasted for a good three and a half months. It was a real major impact as far as the construction industry goes. During the shutdown, we were able to maintain about 20 to 30 workers doing various life safety tasks in the hospitals, in the biotechs, and helping out get some of these field hospitals up and running. We were able to maintain our office staff. We're very happy to do that. Most of our staff was already prepared to work from home, and the rest were very quickly to get them up running due to today's technology. We learned a new word during the shutdown, and it's the word Zoom. I remember when I was a child, Zoom was a TV show. It was like the Sesame Street thing. But today, I'd wake up at 6 in the morning, typically get on a Zoom call, and those Zoom calls typically lasted about 6 p.m. And you'd say, where did the day go? It was one of these times where we felt fortunate because we were able to maintain our office staff. We were bidding work, we were chasing work, and we're still continuing doing coordination for the work that was going on in the field. Our CAD designers were operating from home. So we quickly adapted to something that we never believed we could, and that was to do actually construction from home and maintain our business. I will give a shout out to the general contractors and all the unions. They did a tremendous job helping us prepare for this. We had many Zoom calls with them, with the general contractors, talking basically about safety. The real challenge to us, and I'm sure to John and everybody else, was the unknown, and that was when. When are we returning? Is it 2 weeks, a month? Did anyone ever imagine it'd be 3.5 months? We're talking about it. Here we are 6 months later. The other issue was securing PPE, and it was a major task, but the companies all banded together. Again, we went back to the Zoom calls with the general contractors' help. It was finding the PPE. So when we did get that call, how could we return and how could we return safely? That was probably the hardest part of being out of work was getting the PPE for the workers to return safely. So in one sense, being plumbers and electricians, we're fortunate because we're one of the first trades back on site, and we needed additional bathrooms, we needed additional hand washing stations. So we were able to get a workforce back early on, get these job sites up safe and running, get an idea for it. But the one thing we're still working on as a team together, and everybody's banded together to work on this, is what John alluded to, is that's controlling the lost time due to social distancing. We're doing the temperature screenings in the morning, the vertical transportation on job sites, and the hardest part for construction work is the social distances, because we do work with a lot of heavy objects and it takes more than one person. You need help getting this done. But in general, that's what happened. I mean, we're very fortunate to be construction workers, and we feel definitely part of the easier part of the trades getting back to work. Although we've been impacted, we're very fortunate. We certainly appreciate everything that's been done to help us. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dan. John, the next question is coming to you. The next question is, when looking at entry-level positions, starting careers in the construction industry, for those interested in a rewarding career without taking on the debt, what do you see for opportunities in the upcoming year?
So I'll start with the traditional apprenticeship program. I think we have seen in the last 10 years and continue to see the importance of bringing in a large percentage of younger people into our industry through the apprenticeship program. We do have, and I don't have the data, maybe someone on this panel does, but we do have an aging workforce in the trades. So the sooner we can get younger people or less experienced people into the trades, and we can work them into our organizations, into the culture of our company, and get them matched up with mentors and advisors who can share with them their experience, the sooner the better. Those positions of apprentice in my company are very much valued. We have a workforce that is leaving quickly. So we need to, and Dan, I'm sure you have this in your organization, we need those mentor relationships to develop as soon as humanly possible. So that younger apprentice can match up with that plumber or that electrician or that foreman for our companies and really start to absorb the information and the experience. So those positions today continue to be just as important pre-COVID, post-COVID. I will also say that for people coming into the industry, particularly, again, younger people, their understanding, their familiarity with technology is a huge advantage. So there are positions within, entry-level positions within companies like ours, whether it be an assistant project manager, whether it's a junior estimator, it could be a junior CAD operator, where those younger people, the day they come in the door, they have a certain skill set and familiarity with technology that does give them a leg up than we saw, say, 10 years ago. So I think those positions continue to be very important for companies like us to fill. And I think programs like Building Pathways can go a long way to help us individually and as an industry to find those talented people and to get them placed.
Great, thank you, John. And Dan, we'll turn it over to you for the same question, please.
Thank you. We're seeing the exact same thing as John mentioned. I mean, the entry-level positions are there. Unfortunately, I think they're delayed, possibly another 6 months. What's happened is the Plumbers Union just recently did interviews. We had 400 applications. Typically, we take in 50 to 60 young men and women. This year, we're taking in 23. So that has really cut the class in half. And the reason only half the class was brought in, we really don't know truly what's going to happen in the next 6 months in construction. I think we all feel it's coming back, but it could be, another 6-8 months away from really fulfilling that role. So the class has been cut in half, but there are still opportunities for young men and women out there to become assistant project managers in these companies, to start as a truck driver or to start as warehouse help and to work their way up in the trade. So I do believe those opportunities are still out there. They're just probably delayed a little bit, but we are progressing forward, trying to add staff at this time. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dan. And Linda, we'll turn it over to you for the same question.
Thank you. So I agree with John and Dan. I would say that, there are opportunities, right, in terms of the construction industry, but it's also how do we start talking about it earlier for folks who may not have had families that grew up in the union, right? To understand that this is work to create opportunities for your families and to really be able to be successful. I would say the intergenerational piece real quick, so important. John, you talked about mentoring. That I'd say the greatest generation, the older generation, has so much experience. And before they retire or decide to move on, it is important to pairing them up with the younger folks who are coming into the trades, because there's things, yes, you can learn from the books, right? No doubt about it. But this hands-on experience of 20 years, 30 years, 40 years are critical and valuable. So the mentorship piece is so, so important. And that's something we're looking to do and have been working on at Suffolk. I'd say the piece around the pipeline, very critical, right? The apprenticeships, that are available, big ups to Building Pathways for the work that they continue to do. It's how do we get more folks into the apprenticeship program? Work with Brian all the time, working with the carpenters, just working with various unions to say, how can we be helpful, as a GC, to try to bring people, into the trades along the way. We manage projects, like for instance, we did Orient Heights in East Boston, and we have to recruit people from the public housing development, right, to be part of the trade. So Margarita on our team has been great in terms of getting people, from the development who wants to work and be in a union and getting them plugged in. So it's been a great partnership in terms of that effort. I do think the skills around technology is going to be important, right, as we move towards the next iteration of what construction is going to look like in terms of the disruption that's going to be taking place. There's things that we could do differently. Using technology is going to make it easier, right? Before we break ground on a project, how do we do 4D modeling, 3D modeling, taking the architect drawing, which is what's happening now, putting it in so we can see, okay, if the staircase is going X way and we put it up in a 3D format, and it's like, well, no, Sally Mac, John and them would be like, oh, no, stairs can't quite go in this direction. Dan's team would be like, no, the plumbing has to go there. So it's how do we rework it internally before even breaking ground? So I do think the piece around technology, that is a big step up if people have that background. But it's also really talking about construction differently too, right? I think folks still think of it as just hammer and nail, which it is, no doubt about it, but there's so many different aspects, right? When you think of technology, when you think of like graphic design, when you think of CAD, I think Dan said that, right? There's all these different things that are happening, and so how do we prepare folks for that one, but how do we let people know that this is a place, working in construction, on the operations, on the functional side, this is a place where you can make a difference in your life and your family's lives, right? And I think that's going to be important moving forward as well.
Great. Yeah, appreciate that. And for the third question, we're going to come to Dan and then Linda and then John. So Dan, to you, we're going to ask, are there specific skill sets or qualities you're looking for in a candidate that will help them in your field and in their career as they think about construction?
I mean, as far as skill sets, we're always going to need experience. We're always going to need experienced labor. And what to me, what that means, the best skill sets they can come with. Number one, I always say, and I tell the young men and women, it's all about attitude and punctuality. If you're early for work, if you're on time, you're late. So
That's right.
Our business is always about attitude, and it's about wanting it. If you want to be successful in this business, there's an opportunity there, and everybody will help you be successful if you want it. It's all about the desire. But to your question, so skilled labor is always going to be there. We're going to need it, whether it's residential or commercial construction. But to Linda's point, I think the other side of this is, and this new generation that's coming up, they're so far advanced from myself. John's probably way ahead of me because he's a lot younger than me. But as far as computers and technology, I mean, the younger generation, they can take, to Linda's point, they can take these models and they can see things that we can't see, we can't even dream about. We used to draw them with pencils and erasers. A lot more erasers than pencils, but today's technology, it's live, it's 3D modeling, and it fits, it makes it fit. And what's happening is that modeling now is becoming into our prefab shops. I know John has quite a prefab shop. We have a major prefab shop. So all the stuff that's built in the prefab shop, all has to be modeled first. So if there's one thing in the construction side, if someone doesn't want to become a skilled laborer, then there's the CAD design side of it, and you're working with computers all day and making stuff work. And that is just a trade in itself that is emerging. It's going to continue to emerge on a daily basis as we move forward in society. Thank you very much.
Very good, Dan.
Thank you.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
Good. Okay, I'll
Sorry,
jump in.
Lindy.
Okay, great.
You're
I totally agree, Dan. I know that the technology piece is going to be important, but I do think it's attitude, right? And very important. So how do you have a workforce, so we want folks, to come into the workforce, whether it's Suffolk or anywhere, or at Sully Mac or Dan and the Plumbers, is, that really cares about people too, right? And I would say the motto is, how do you treat people the way you want to be treated, right? Core. Right, which is important because you want folks who are part of the team that has the idea of, you want to be respected, then how do we respect others? So I do think the attitude and coming in with a perspective that we're all in it together is going to be important. Now you can't, that's not everybody, right? So how do we help train, right? Because you have folks who are great at what they do, but hey, they may not be a people person, and it's okay. Then, we have to give you the skill set to be able to do that and to manage people. That, we said CAD, no doubt about it. I say folks who are really eager to learn, right? And want to just absorb it all is very important. Because you may come into, through the trades, absolutely. Skilled labor will never go away. I mean, we know, come on, we need it 100%. Workforce is aging, people are retiring. We need to really create the pipeline of folks who are in vocation and saying, you know what, I really want to take this as a career path. But how do we encourage people to do it, right? Because if you haven't seen role models in your family that's part of a union, that's part of the plumbers, electrical, or carpentry, or what have you, then how do you know you're part of that? And so there's a lot of work that's been happening as well with Brian and other unions to say, you know what, we are an open place. I say we, I'm not part of the union, but we are in it together holistically.
Excellent.
But that we are an open place. We believe in diversity in terms of ethnic diversity, in terms of gender, in terms of more women coming into the unions and into the skilled pipeline, in terms of the skilled labor force. And there's still a lot of work that we have to do. So I would say that we have to double our efforts, right, in terms of working together on recruitment and speaking about the holistic opportunities that are in construction, right? Whether it's skilled labor, the technology piece, and the whole nine is going to be critical moving forward.
Thank you, Linda. And John, we'll turn it over to you. Same question.
Yeah, thank you. I may add a little bit to Linda's last comment about sort of a holistic approach. I will say we have had success in our company over the years, and more on the foreman level in the field and in the project management level in the company, where we've done a lot of aptitude testing, where we'll take an employee and we'll go through a series of aptitude tests and then collect the data and then sit with them and go through it so they have a better understanding of themselves, what their strengths, what their weaknesses are, how they communicate, how they don't communicate. It's been a self-education for a lot of our employees, and it's led to success for the company. As I look at the emerging workforce, I see an opportunity there to help them self-educate as well. One of the things I think Dan and I can agree to over the years is an apprenticeship is also an opportunity for people to mature. If they come in at a young age, they are young and they're inexperienced and they're not completely developed yet. It is impressive over a 5-year period when you can watch somebody really mature professionally and personally. And I think today, maybe some of those aptitude tests, some of that self-education could be brought down into the apprenticeship group. So it helps them mature effectively over that 5-year or 4 or 5-year apprenticeship program. That's just something we're toying with as a company. We've done some mentoring. We continue to try and find the best way to do that. But I also think some education for these people coming into the workforce, it's going to help them personally and it's going to help them professionally if they better understand their skills and aptitudes. So just wanted to offer that up.
Great. Thank you, John. That's a great answer. And we have a fourth answer for the panel, and I see some questions from the audience and from organizations coming in. So we'll wrap up the intro round with this fourth question, and we'll ask Linda, then John, then Dan. Are you seeing predictable trends in the next 6 to 12 months that workforce organizations should be considering as they're planning their programs to help people think about their careers? So this one is for workforce organizations. Any trends you think they should have as they start to plan their programs? Linda, we'll start with you.
Very good, Brian. I mean, great question. I think, the 6 to 12 months, no doubt, I'm going to say it is unpredictable, right? Because as you think of COVID-19, that, it appears we kind of have it under control here in Massachusetts. But when you look at schools opening, right, there's an impact, right? And I say that because as the young folks are going off to school, I'm a mom of 4, by the way, right? But as adults and the parents who are looking to go back to work, if there is an outbreak, whether it's virtual or hybrid models that are happening in our schools, then there is going to be an impact in terms of the workforce, right? Whether or not they're even going to physically be able to come back to the office or to the construction site, to do the work. So I would say that, for us, or for me, I'm not going to talk for the whole company, but it's really keeping an eye out and really paying attention to the data and the modeling that is happening, in particular here in Massachusetts. I'm going to say we have a lot of universities, right, that are opening, and there's a lot of students coming from all over the country, and their spikes are pretty high, and yet the young people are coming into our state, and so that is very concerning. And so we hope and pray that there's not going to be a huge uptick, but we do not know. So I will say the next 6 to 12 months, we are looking at the universities and the recruitments, no doubt, right? As we're talking about construction differently, letting them know about us as a company, who we are, what we're trying to do, how we'd love to have them be part of our family, being intentional around our recruitment. We go into colleges and universities now, we're going into affinity groups, right? There are Black student forums, there are Latinx students, Latin students, there are Asian students on these campuses. It's how we're going to be purposeful in really working on recruiting. I think the piece around the pipeline and working with the building pathways is so critical. Working with the Office of Workforce Development, Suffolk has been working around the whole piece around the driver's license, right? The HDL, the drivers, that whole thing, the hoisting piece. We've been working hand in hand with the city. That's still going to be critical. And really trying to get the unemployment, even though construction unemployment, like Dr. Modestino said, has decreased, right? It has fallen significantly. There are other folks who are still unemployed that maybe never thought of getting an HDL hoisting license, right? Or never thought of being a truck driver. And so how do we get those folks into these programs to know, you can get retrained and there's opportunities here for you. So I do think, it's going to be interesting 6 to 12 months. Hopefully, the construction industry holds, right? Because I would say that as we think of municipalities and federal government and state government, even as the economy may go down below, these projects continue, right? And Dr. Modestine touched on this in terms of the whole piece around residential development. Okay, I'm just going to put it a quick plug and say there are 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth. Boston cannot be the only city that is creating housing, okay? We need these other communities to do their part. There's a housing choice bill. You wouldn't know I was a former state senator, right? So there's a housing choice bill that is being promoted, okay? I was chair of housing in the Senate and worked on this bill, but Governor Baker and his administration are focusing on this, and it's to support housing production in the Commonwealth. Their goal is to create 135,000 new units, new housing units by 2025. It's not going to happen until, our reps and our senators vote for it, and let's get it on the governor's desk. And what he's trying to do in a creative way is tackle some of the zoning issues that have been preventing housing creation in our communities around the Commonwealth. So I think that is important. I will now stop. So I gave you guys homework. Everyone that's listening, reach out your folks and say we need to get the housing choice bill built. It's creating jobs. It's going to put people to work, and let's just get housing done around the Commonwealth.
Thank you, Linda. We appreciate all sides of it. John, we'll turn it to you for the same question around trends you're seeing in 6 to 12 months for organizations as they plan.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to add, I would encourage and implore any of the workforce development organizations that are active in our community to continue to be active. Yes, it's an unsettled future with COVID, but if we can look beyond COVID, I think we're a very vibrant business industry or community within Boston and Massachusetts. I think construction will continue. I think it's a great trade. I think the skills are irreplaceable. So I would bet on construction on the long run. And if I was an individual, I would bet on it as a good career that will be here 50, if not 100 years from today. So we need the workforce groups to continue to do their work. We will get back to work. I would add that I think those folks who unfortunately are, been organized, they've found the trade they want to get into, and now all of a sudden we've hit this COVID impact and the available jobs has very rapidly retracted. I think if you're in that situation and the workforce development groups, you know who they are, and Dan and I have some of those people in our organizations. I would encourage them to just continue to try and find opportunity anywhere they can, and especially if they can't find opportunity, to not give up on it, but to continue to find ways to educate themselves on their specific trade. Whether you're at home and you've got access to the internet and a computer, you can find information about the electrical and plumbing trades or carpentry trade or whatever it happens to be. And use that time, if you have time, just to continue to grow in some way with your knowledge. It will pay off. As I said, we will get through COVID. We are seeing a recovery. We hope it will continue. And I think there will be opportunities. So use the time. I have 3 boys at home and they like to complain about how COVID has impacted them. And I've explained to them it's impacted everybody. And I don't want to hear their complaints. Make the best of it. And for those people who are impacted, just try and find some way to continue on in their career, because I think it's a good career and hopefully it's a good choice for them. So I'll end with that.
Great. Thank you, John. Appreciate the advice. And Dan, we'll turn to you for the same question.
Okay. I'll just add to it. I think we're going to continue to have to work from home safely. We're going to have to find creative ways to be able to continue to work from home, to make everybody productive and be successful, and to keep the workers safe in the field. And I truly believe that what we're doing has been tremendous as far as wearing the mask. On the construction sites, to Linda's point, John's point, we're taking temperatures, we're doing social distancing, they're doing the temperatures in the morning, they're wearing the mask, they're wearing the gloves, safety glasses. I think it's working. I think you can continue to get this together as a group, and we just maintain it. I think what's going to happen, the biggest industries in the next 6 months, along with the housing, and I love that, Linda, let's keep pushing for the housing, but I think the biotechs and the hospitals are really coming into gear at this point. New England, Cambridge and Boston is really the headquarters for the biggest manufacturing biotech firms in the world. They're all coming here. If they're not in Cambridge, they're in Boston. So I think that's really the future. We've seen just in the past 4 months a real uptick in the biotech construction. There's a big need for that, and that creates a lot of jobs for us. So I think moving forward, to find the cure for this virus will be the key for us within the next 6 months, hopefully, and we can continue on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And a very important question came across the screen, and it's something we've all been focusing on, but I'd love to hear folks elaborate on it a little bit. So as we're returning to work, one of the two goals here for the building trade unions and our contractor partners is to make sure every career in the construction industry is a good career that supports families and communities. And secondly, that the same mission is to make sure that everyone has access to them. So this question's around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how are we prioritizing those steps as we're as we're returning to work, how are we keeping that primary in the center of the conversation? And you know what? I'm going to go back to our 1, 2, 3 order here. Linda, if you don't mind leading off on this question, how do you feel about diversity, equity, inclusion as one of our primary goals as we're thinking through pandemic and getting back to work? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. I mean, No doubt, equity, diversity, inclusion is critical, right? And everyone's talking about it now. And obviously, there's been a lot from the pandemic, the health pandemic with COVID, but there's been a whole racial unrest, right? That's happened with the murder of George Floyd. And so, but it's really triggered a conversation, which I say is so important, because I think for a long time, you know, folks saw things happening, but it was kind of like, oh, okay, well, I don't really see it. But when everyone's home, everyone's dealing with COVID. And for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, you know, we saw what happened to George, you know, with the knee in the neck. And I think it really transformed the conversation. And I want to thank Brian. You know, they did a stand down that happened at the Orient Heights site, where we took a moment, and it was for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, a moment of silence. And you realize the amount of time, right, that is, you know, that nothing was done. And I say all this because it's just a jumping off point, right? And so I think it's important, you know, that these conversations take place in companies and families and communities, and to recognize that it doesn't have to be adversarial, but it's recognizing us seeing ourselves in other people, right? I want folks to see, wow, if George was my brother, my father, my cousin, my nephew, God, how would I feel, right? So I do think the conversation around diversity, ethnic diversity in particular, gender diversity, when we think of construction, is something that's not going to go away. I think we have to double down and lean into it, right? And not be afraid to have the conversations, or to allow spaces for your employees and people, you know, that work with us to be able to talk about it, and to say, you know what, we want to do things differently. You know, this America is a great America. We know that. You know, I'm first generation American. My parents immigrated here from Haiti, and here I was a state senator, right, for the first Suffolk district that had Dorchester, South Boston, Mattapan, and Hyde Park. Incredible place. But we also recognize that in other parts of this country, the opportunity is not there for everyone that looks like me, right? Or folks are being, you know, picked on, or whatever. And so I'm going to say that, you know, let's have the conversation, want to be partners with everyone on this call, but it's important, and it's recognizing, you know, that we're in it together, that, you know, this is something that has to be front and center. Not only municipal projects, state projects, and federal projects are going to be laser focused on this, right? So when we think of construction for us, you know, when we think of construction, when we think of the Boston Employment Commission, the city's Boston Job Ordinance, right? They require certain things, right? The Boston residents piece, right? 51% Boston residents, people of color, women. This is stuff that's important to us, but also important to the industry. So if we could start moving in that direction, when we think of the pipeline, when we think of apprenticeships, when we think of who are we putting into these programs, it's going to be important that we double down and we focus and we say, okay, we're going to be intentional. And yes, it's okay, right? If we have a class of 50, then 25 should be people of color. I know that's pretty bold, right? But you know what I mean? And it's okay. And there's no need to apologize for it, but it's saying, hey, we're in it together. We want to create the opportunity that has not been there for everyone from the beginning. And so now we're going to be purposeful in it, and we're going to row in it, and we're going to lean into it. So yeah, it's going to be a lot of conversation. This is a journey. Everyone remember, this is a journey. It's not going to happen overnight, but I'm really excited because folks have been talking about it, especially in our industry, and looking to do things differently. So thank you, Brian, for your leadership, because I know we've worked on this before. So.
Linda, you've been a great partner, and John and Dan, you've all been great partners in this effort for diversity, equity, inclusion. And Linda, love all of your points. I think they're great. And would love to hear from John and Dan. So I'm going to turn it over to John for the same question. John, diversity, equity, inclusion, and to Linda's point, racial justice efforts. How do we continue to prioritize these efforts? All yours, John.
So, Brian, you can help me for 1 second. How long ago was Mary Walsh elected? Do you know, roughly?
13 elected, took office in 14.
Okay. So for me, thank you. So for me personally, diversity and equity and inclusion, Mayor Walsh was elected. He actually held a meeting at the Boston Convention Center with contractors. Dan, if my memory serves, you were there as well. But in that meeting, he called on us and the union trades to really look at ourselves and to look were we out in the communities? Were we pulling in people of color? Were we looking for women? What were we doing? And he kind of put it to us that we weren't doing enough and we needed to do more. I think for me, that was a moment of a bit of an aha. I had always dealt with their BRJP requirements in the city of Boston. I knew what they were. We had never exceeded them. We had come close, but we really had not put a lot of effort into it, to be quite honest. And I think after that meeting with the mayor, for me, it became something that I prioritized within the company. And we really started working with building pathways. We started working with Madison Park. We started getting out into the Boston community and other communities and looking to diversify ourselves as a company. And I've seen benefits to it that I didn't understand would be there at the time. I've also seen our union, which is the Electrical Union Local 103 here in Boston, also embrace it in a very genuine way. So it has made it easier for me as a company that hires from the union. The fact that they're embracing it, that they're working with building pathways, that they're out in the community as well. I've seen real progress in that 5 or 6 years since the mayor first took over. And I heard his message and I've taken it and moved forward. So to Linda's point, it is a bit of a journey. I think it takes a lot of people to get on board. I felt like it was coming together. It was progressing better pre the murder of George Floyd. And I think since then, the conversation is a national conversation. And I'm seeing and hoping, I should say, for progress, continued progress at an accelerated rate. So I'm gonna end there, Brian, and hand back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. And I just wanted to take a note on your point. There were over 300 contractors in all of the unions in Greater Boston at that event. And there was a charge free, and folks are doing their best to answer that charge and that call. So appreciate you bringing that up. Dan, how are we going to continue to prioritize the diversity, equity, inclusion, and the racial justice efforts since that point? But folks are doing every day. How are we going to continue that now? And how can we prioritize it? Continue to prioritize.
Yeah, I think to your point, Brian, to John's point, Linda's point, I think, to prioritize it, we really need to sit down, and we have done this, sit down with the unions and bring in some bigger classes of minorities, of people of color and women. I know last year the Plumbers Local 12 brought in 17 women. I mean, the next class we should look at bringing in, additional people of color, giving them the opportunities. I know we've all worked very hard at it. Brian, when you were back at the Building Pathways, when I first met you back, it was probably 2012, 2013, when Mayor Walsh first started that program. I know that program you've started it. It's made tremendous strides. It's just taking that next step that we're all talking about. It's at the forefront. We just haven't made that turn yet. But I think with all of us working together, all the companies working together, with everyone's help and the mayor's help and Brian's help, we can certainly make that next step forward. Thank you.
Dan, thanks so much. And before we move on to the next question, I would be remiss. That program was started by Mayor Walsh under a project labor agreement at the Boston Housing Authority to make sure folks had access to these great careers that support families and communities. And Trin Wynn from Mayor's administration was instrumental in launching that program with Mary Vogel, the executive director of that program, a program that has been around for going on a decade now. And I know that the three of you are lead sponsors of that program. And it's that type of effort that has led to some successes. And I think we all recognize there's a long way to go. But I do appreciate everyone's commitment to this work. So we're going to continue that and to continue to prioritize it. And as we think about, we have more questions from our audience that I'd like to get to. And one of them in front of me right now, it says, as companies, has the pandemic accelerated investment in technology, the digital tools and applications and various technologies that you all can use in your various day-to-day as companies in construction? Has COVID had you accelerate investment in those spaces? And I will start with John.
Thanks, Brian. So yeah, great question. And no question, if you weren't as a company prepared from a technology standpoint when COVID broke out, you got prepared very quickly by investing in the systems that you needed. If you were prepared and you could work remote, you patted yourself on the back and then you invested more money in it and more focus on it. It has become Something we talked about for years. Office people have wanted to have some flexibility. I'll be quite direct. We're in Dorchester. I've always been in Dorchester. People are commuting from, well, some people live here in the neighborhood, some people live just outside Boston, and some people live an hour and a half away. Those commutes with traffic, again, pre-COVID and during 2019, sort of the boom economy, traffic was so bad we were having trouble keeping people. They were leaving simply because they were spending 2 to 3 hours a day in a car. We didn't realize, even though it was in front of us, we didn't realize we could work remote in 2019. It is readily apparent in 2020 because of COVID that we can. So yes, to answer that question, it's probably a long answer. We did invest in technology and we continue to. It's a great tool to get people to where they need to be remotely, and we will continue to in the future.
Great, no, great answer, John. We appreciate that. Dan, we're going to turn to you for the same question. Have you invested in technology since the pandemic?
Yeah, to John's point, we have invested. We were fortunate. Most of our people were already set up to work from home, and we very quickly got everybody set up from home. But what we've done is now if this should happen again in the near future, if we have another upturn of the virus, everybody's ready to work from home tomorrow. Everybody's could just go. We have half the office working here now. We have half the office working from home. We're rotating people in, so we're 100% prepared to do that. What it's really pushed in our fab shop, we like to say we're at the cutting edge of it, but it's helped us to really push to do more and more fab, because it's less workers on the job site. It's easier here to keep them social distance, and it's easier here to do the production, get more done, and keep everybody safe. And that's the biggest goal, is to keep less workers on all of these job sites. But we're not taking away jobs. We're actually creating jobs in other areas. We have the ability in our fab shop to work 2 different shifts. So it's always air conditioned out there. There's always light out there. So they don't have to all work at the same hours, and we can do construction. We can spread that construction schedule out, but not affect these buildings from getting built. Thank you.
Great, Dan, thank you for the answer. And Linda, we'll turn to you for the same question. Investment in technology in the time of the pandemic.
Yeah, I'll say that, we have an incredible IT team, right? We never worked from home, so that was never an option. And so we had invested, like John and the EC, they had invested in technology. But what we saw with COVID, just like John and Dan, is that, we were able to transition. We transitioned pretty quickly. People were able to work from home. And now, coming from a company that kind of felt like, if you're working from home, are you really working, right? But what all of you all have seen, whether it's Zoom or Microsoft Teams or the other platforms, is that people are working. Actually, they are working even more intensely, right? And more where you're trying to tell people, okay, you have to disconnect. But then, like, for instance, I'm in my breakfast nook right now. So I sit here like Dan from early in the morning until evening. And then in the between, my kids are like, can I have lunch? And I'm like, oh my God, it's 1. I got to make lunch really quick, right? But I think the other piece that has happened, so yes, we've transitioned pretty smoothly in terms of technology working from home. But I do think the other thing has happened. It's really strengthened the community. And the different teams at Suffolk. So for instance, people in culture, we're on Zoom, we're having like functions, trying to do like social events, getting to know events. So I do think even though we're not physically together, it has really brought more people together, right? Can you all, that makes sense, as I said, together and together 500 times, but it really has brought us closer together, because even if you were in the physical office, you're not sitting next to each other, right? And you don't have time to get up and go see that person. And so these meetings have really strengthened relationships, I think have strengthened teams, and it has made it a little bit smoother. Though I gotta say, people are ready to kind of go back as well. But so far so good.
I think one of the interesting trends that we're seeing with companies adopting technology, I think in the past, technology has been a dirty word, like it's going to replace workers, robots are going to take all of our jobs. And one of the things that the pandemic's done is accelerated that, like other periods of disruption, like other recessions, where we look for, technologies that make us more efficient. And now we found technologies that help us keep workers employed, right? Like Dan was talking about, running 2 shifts, doing prefab kind of work, or Linda, you even mentioned earlier about using technology to do better planning up front to make sure that you have a better game plan going in so that you don't waste time having to make changes later and things like that. And these are all like really efficient things that, if anything, would increase employment, right? And so I think we're seeing a different view of technology than we had in the past, not just to deal with COVID, but instead of going back to normal, going back to something that's an even better production situation in some ways.
Thank you for that, Dr. Mastino. We appreciate the contribution. So there have been two follow-up questions on both of the past two questions, and I'll lead with the first one since we're on the topic of technology. The follow-up question is, you in the beginning of the phone call, you mentioned an aging workforce. Have you seen challenges, or have the various ages adapted well to these technologies? That's the question. And Dan Bent, it's your turn. We'll start with you, then Linda, then John. But sure. Dan has, thank you.
Thank you. What we have seen is we have had, I'd say, half a dozen of our aging workforce retire, unfortunately. They just didn't feel safe, so they felt that they were at the retirement age. I'd say all of these workers planned on working another 1 year to 2 years, but due to what's going on, they just decided at this time it was best for them to retire. So that has definitely made an impact. I mean, we need that leadership. We need that older generation to teach the younger generation. There's so much skill that's lost. Technology is one thing, but you still have to go lay the work out and figure out how to do it. So you can make the computer whistle, but you still have to know the meanings behind it, where to set that water closet, where to set that lavatory. So it's not as simple as we all think, because you need that generation to actually teach the younger generation so that they can move on. But that's really the impact that we've seen as far as us personally. Just I'd say 6 workers have decided to retire. So
great, thank you for that input, Dan. And Linda, we'll turn to you for the same question.
Yeah, so I'll just say really quick, agree with Dan 100%, right? This generation is so important, right? Because they're able to solve issues quickly too, right? In terms of the new generation that's coming in, again, book learning or what have you, but you have folks who's been in it, man, has been in the trenches for like 20, 30, 40 years. They're able to pivot really quick. So how do we take that knowledge and the experience and really be able to blend it with the incoming groups of young folks? Going back to the mentorship piece that John talked about, it's so important. When we talk about technology, how do we teaming up, the I'm the X generation, but the Y and the millennials and now the Z generation, to team up with an older cohort, right? To say, hey, we're going to be in it together. We're on a team, we're on a project team together, and I may not know the technology end, but you'll help me manage through it. But yet we're learning together. And I think that's so important, because a lot of times, we lose sight of that. Like our company, we're like over 50% millennials, right? So it's a pretty like young young cohort of folks that are coming in. But for us is the respect, that we give to our older generation, because they have the experience, they have that, and we want to make sure it's not lost before they retire. How do we capture that? How do we create an environment where there's an intergenerational? We talk about resource groups, right? So as D&I employee resource groups, we have a women one, Build Pride, LGBTQIA, plus we have a veterans one, and one of the ones we're thinking of is an intergenerational one, right? Where we have the older generation with the younger, and we're just going to have conversations and really make sure that people feel comfortable and recognizing that, the younger person's not here to take your job, right? But it's how do we learn together? We're part of this family, and we're trying to build the best building and do the best work, and we're in it together. But yeah, so that's going to be really interesting, is that piece around as the older generation decides to retire, because COVID is a big deal.
Thank you, Linda. And John, we'll turn to you.
Yeah, Brian, could you do me a favor? Could you just repeat the question? I want to make sure I answer it correctly.
Sure can. So the question is, as you are investing in these new technologies, has there been any challenges or a pretty quick adaptation from all ages of your workforce? And the question specifically was, have the older generation of workers been able to, adapt to the new technologies in your organization?
Okay, thank you. So I think the overall stereotype is that the older employees are going to struggle with technology. There's some truth to it. I have seen plenty of them, though, adapt pretty quickly if given the time to sort of absorb it. if they're given time and you can give them the instruction, they generally can get it and get comfortable with it. I've also seen those clever older workers get a hold of a younger employee within the company and, team up, and then all of a sudden they can get there much more quickly. So like anything, you have to be open-minded to it and be interested in trying to figure it out. And once you have those two skills, I think they, in given time, they can adapt to it pretty quickly. So certainly it's been a challenge for some older employees, but not one they haven't been able to sort out.
Great, thank you, John. And that ties together well with Linda's point and Dan's point of sometimes the teamwork of generations is also very helpful. Dr. Mostino, would you weigh in on this particular question, or any trends that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think this is a trend that we're seeing across the board. I mentioned it in education. It's even happening in healthcare, where we've seen if you are a sole proprietor as a physician and you are on the cusp of retirement, you would be thinking about, is now the time to sell your practice or to move on or take a different role. I think it's important not to lose this knowledge, to be able to find different roles for those folks, to be able to pass on that knowledge. And I think that's perhaps another innovation that we would not have really considered pre-COVID. Like, for example, there are some school systems that, have asked their teachers who's comfortable coming back, who's not. And there's going to be some remote teaching that's going to go on regardless this year. There will be students who are in vulnerable populations who cannot be in school. And so let's reassign the teaching tasks, right? So that those teachers who are also vulnerable can be matched up with those students. And similarly, you could think of in the construction industry, when you're thinking about these apprenticeship programs, is there a role for these older workers to play in the apprenticeship program so that we're not going to entirely lose that knowledge? Do they need to entirely, completely retire? Can they that they had hoped to continue working, passing their knowledge on to the younger workers in a more structured way, and making use and tapping into that experience in a way that we just never really considered before. We've always seen those kinds of programs as having a certain predefined curriculum that maybe can be improved upon and add this experiential component to it that we don't want to lose.
Great, thank you, Dr. Mostino. We appreciate that input. And the second follow-up question actually refers back to our question around our diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and especially the racial justice work. The question, and a little bit of background here, is that in the 2 months of COVID during the shutdown, there was a great effort by our unions and our union companies, both labor and management, coming together for about 8 weeks to make sure that there were safety practices and protocols in place when given a green light to return to work. And one of the questions was, how do we make sure that we maintain the priority of diversity, equity, inclusion, and racial justice work as we return to work? And one of the components written into the, I guess we'd call it the universal safety document, was that someone who had a position prior to the shutdown would be given first right of refusal to come back to that same position. Because what we didn't want was newer workers or diverse workers or someone who was in a position to be bumped by, for whatever reason, whether it's experience or relationships or anything. How do we guard against some of the practices that can lead to some of those institutional challenges around racism and sexism? And I guess the question that I'm following up on is, how do we continue to maintain that as we're ramping back up, we're keeping the same equity and inclusion and diversity as before the pandemic, and how are we making sure that those opportunities are still there as we're building back up? And I see folks nodding their heads, and I will go back in reverse order this time. I will start with Dan, and then John, and then Linda. So how do we maintain? Thanks, Dan.
So we've basically, like I said, we were very fortunate as a company because all of our jobs basically started back up. So there was a 2 to 3 week window where we slowly brought back the workers on the job sites, and we typically brought them back in the same roles they were before. To your point, Brian, we met with you, we met with the building trades, building trades and the unions. That was the agreement, that all workers that were on those job sites would go back to those job sites. If additional workers were required after that, then we would seek out to hire additional workers. But we very quickly adapted within the first 2 to 3 weeks to bring everybody back. So the goals we had prior to that, as far as diversity on all these job sites, we maintain those same goals as of today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan. Appreciate the input. And John, we'll turn to you next.
Yeah, I think from a practical standpoint, we laid off very quickly, and then we started to recover. And to Dan's point, as subcontractors, we still are committed and obligated to get these jobs done. So we would restaff with the same group of people. You know, when you get an apprentice or an electrician or a foreman onto a job site, and they've been there for 3 months or 2 years, they have a certain amount of knowledge about that building, how to move around it, where things are, what the security procedures are. So they're important to get back onto those sites, simply because their knowledge adds to their efficiency and their ability to execute. So I think from a pure practical standpoint, we as a trade or an industry would always try and bring the same people back for various reasons. And I think you also have the backdrop of, you know, the Boston Residency Job Program and those sort of requirements that we have and goals. You know, it's important to us to make them. I think the general contractors also do a very good job of pushing us to make sure that we're on top of that and paying attention to it. So I do think there are some backstops. And I think from a union perspective, if I was a union tradesperson and I didn't get brought back, I do have the opportunity to go to the union that I'm a member of and say, you know, why wasn't I brought back? And that union, I would expect, would call Sally Mack, and we would have a conversation and have to have a reason for not having brought them back, a valid reason. So I think there are some protocols or precautions, protections in place for individual employees.
That's John, that's great feedback. And Linda, before we turn to you, if you don't mind, just a point of note, during the shutdown, the building trade unions in Boston and the surrounding area represent about 35,000 working families. About 35,000 members in Boston and Greater Boston do this as their careers. During the shutdown, most of our local unions had unemployment between 70 and 90%. So we're talking about tens of thousands of people who went away from work, and then how do we get them back to work as we started to ramp back up after the protocols for safety were back in place. So Linda, I'll refer back to the question. How do we maintain the laser focus on prioritizing equity as we're coming back, just as much as we're doing for the past decade or so?
Very good, Brian. Thank you. I echo John and Dan. I think that, you know, the protocols are in place. As we look at, you know, as a GC, we work closely with the unions and our union companies, right? As we work on the BRJP, you know, these requirements for the city. And it's one is boots on the ground, no doubt, in terms of the employees and the people that are being hired. But the other piece is also the small business piece, right? These small businesses that are in construction, that are led by people of color, but that are also led by women. We're working on really creating that pipeline, as well as the city is looking to do more, right, around how are we making sure there's access and opportunity for these small businesses. So we've been working really hard, you know, in terms of doing a series called Trade Partnership Series, really trying to prepare these businesses and learning the skill of the trade in terms of the business aspect. What does it mean, you know, as we look at scheduling projects can kill small businesses, right? We know that. You know, what do we look at around capital, access to capital, and all these different things? How do we help these small businesses so they could build their capacity? So one piece is no doubt boots on the ground, but the other piece we're looking at is around access and building equity, you know, that these small businesses can also participate, you know, in the construction industry. Sully Mack, great partners, Dan, you know, Brian, right? We've been talking about this. How do we, you know, work with our unions? We just had actually a great meeting last week to look at, you know, what are some of the small businesses that are in the space, like for instance in carpentry, you know, that need the capacity, cannot be a prime on a job, right? But how do they become the third or fourth tier on a project, right, and be counted. So those are the things that we're also looking at, is how do we really create the holistic approach, boots on the ground, yes, the small business aspect as well, and really making sure that people feel like they're connected and they're part of it.
I think that's 3 great answers, and I'm looking at the clock, and it's now 11:30. And for the sake of sorry, Linda, was that the completion of your answer?
Yeah, no,
Okay,
I'm done.
great.
I'm like, oh, it's 11:30.
So I will turn back to Justin. Unless there's anything else that we can do, Justin, to be helpful, but that is the questions that we have in front of us, and want to say, you know what, maybe I will turn it over to, just looking across my screen here, I have Dan first, and I have John, then I have Linda. Any closing thoughts, just from the panel's sake? Does that make sense, Justin? Maybe?
Great, yeah.
Great, and then Dr. Modestino, of course, but for the panel, Dan, if you have last thoughts.
I just want to say thank you very much. It was a great opportunity and a pleasure being part of this panel today. I think we can all learn a lot from what we talked about. I think we can all learn a lot about the COVID coming up with the Dr. Moderno's information. Thank you very much. And as far as the diversity factors, it's something that we're all working together as a team, and I know we can overcome that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dan, and very much appreciate your participation and your leadership. John, you're next, please.
Yeah, no, I guess I'd just add, I think Linda used the term, it's a journey. I think we're definitely on a journey to bring in some diversity and to open up the trades, and I think we're getting there. So I look forward to it, and thank you for everyone for your efforts here today. It's always good to talk about it and to start to put some items into action. So I look forward to the future.
John, thanks for your partnership always. We really appreciate your leadership. Linda, final thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this was just a wonderful panel, and I'm happy that, we were able to do this. Thank you, John and Dan. Lively conversations. Brian, you handled it, moderating this team. Justin and Dr. Modestino, thank you for your presentation. Would love the deck. And so, it is a journey, right? And as long as we're kind of willing to work together and to hear the different ideas and opinions, and we're all different, but know that, this is the space and this is the place and this is the work where, we have to continue building on it, right? Because obviously a lot happened pre-COVID where, the movement was happening. As John said, when Mayor first got in, he did these great meetings. And so we know we still have to continue it. And so I just look forward to, to being part of the conversations, to helping in any way that I can. And this has been really a wonderful hour and a half. So thank you all.
Awesome, Linda. Thanks so much for your great leadership and great partnership always. And Dr. Modestino, I think you did a great presentation. I'm going to turn it to you as moderator for a last word.
Sure. Did we skip Dan? Dan, did you got your last word?
Dan.
All right. Yeah, I guess looking forward, as an economist, I think about what do the next 6 to 12 months hold for us. And there are 2 things that I think are encouraging. One is even if the projects that we might have had in the pipeline or in development are not exactly the projects that are going to come out to actually be constructed in the next 6 to 12 months. So I'm thinking like maybe not so many luxury condos or those types of things. But there are going to be, I think, important opportunities going forward, not just in healthcare and biotech, but even, God willing, there is some kind of infrastructure bill that comes out of Congress that helps retrofit schools. Right now, we have aging schools that desperately need good ventilation so we can get kids back in person in school. So parents like me can be working uninterrupted, whether it's from home or in person. So I think that there's an opportunity for the construction industry to be nimble. And I think there'll be opportunities coming forward. And then the last piece of good news that I would share with folks is I think it's becoming very clear that all of our fates are intertwined and we are all in this together. And one of the really encouraging pieces of data that I just saw came out yesterday from the Broad Institute was of the tests that they've been doing, the COVID tests they've been doing for college students as they return to campuses, the positivity rate has been 1/10 of what our state positivity rate has been. So our state's like around 1.7, 1.8. They're finding like 0.02 positive rates among the students. Why is that? Because we told them to quarantine before they came back, and they did it. Why did they do it? Because they want to be here. They want to be in person. They don't want to mess this up. We have like, maybe a few students who need to be corralled here and there. Northeastern certainly gone out on social media and been very public about calling people out for that. But, as we say at Northeastern, it's one pack, red and black. And so everyone needs to keep everyone safe. And I think we're seeing that. So I'm much more optimistic about what the next 6 to 12 months could hold.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Mostina. Thank you. Appreciate the optimism and the optimistic update. And just on behalf of you, just as moderator, you were a wonderful panel. Thank you for a great conversation. I was really proud to be part of it. And just on behalf of all of us, I would like to thank Mayor Walsh for his continued leadership in these very important spaces, to Trin Wynn for always leading on very important conversations too. And Justin, thank you for all the help today, and to Building Pathways and Mary Vogel for helping to coordinate this phone call. So from there, I'll just say thank you and turn it back over to you, Justin. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. Great job today. I would like to thank everyone for participating, the audience, the panelists, the moderator. A great presentation, Alicia. Just a couple of quick things. Again, this webinar will be on our website, owd.boston.gov. So you can go see a recording if you need to refer back to the materials. And lastly, we are going to be, you should receive an email tomorrow that will, if we didn't get to one of your questions, or if you have follow-up questions, the webinar will send you an email that you can follow up with us, and we can get those questions directed to the panelists. And with that, I think we can close. Thank you everyone for participating, and have a great day.
Great. Thank you. Same to you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.